Submit. Okay, we should be recording and you can... We will get started then. So this is a panel of experts here from the University of New Orleans or affiliated with the University of New Orleans on the forthcoming election on November 3rd. So the way we've set this up, we do a pre-election panel and then a panel after the election to analyze the results. So here is the pre-election panel, and we are very grateful to our three speakers today. It's Dr. Christine Day, chairwoman of the Political Science Department at UNO. Christine is also coming in from the outside here on campus, so she is not in the room with us. And then here in the room are Dr. Robert Bobby Dupont, chair of the History Department, and also a many-time visitor of the UNO Innsbruck Summer School and director of the UNO Innsbruck Summer School. And also in here is Jay Hakes, who used to be a political science professor in the 1970s at UNO before he left to work for the Carter administration. And then he eventually became the director of the Carter Library. So we have a very distinguished panel discussion, forward to discussion. The three of them will make presentations. Then we will open the floor for discussions from
Somebody is picking up the mic.
So Chris Day, Dr. Chris Day is going to start. And Chris, can you start with giving our Austrian participants who might not understand the U.S. Electoral College and the U.S. presidential election system a quick rundown how that works? Chris, are you with us?
Yes, I was muted there. Now I'm unmuted. So, yes.
Okay, so
thank you, Günter. It's a real honor to be here with our Austrian colleagues. And as Günter just said, I am going to talk a little bit about the Electoral College, this crazy thing that has existed as long as our country has. When the U.S. Constitution was written in the 1780s, the framers set up only the House of Representatives to be directly elected by the people. The other chamber of Congress, the Senate, originally was to be chosen by the state legislators of their respective states, 2 senators per state, no matter how big or how small. States were allocated House seats, of course, according to population size. And then, so senators are now popularly elected, but not until the constitutional amendment of 1913. So originally only the House was popularly elected, and the president was and still is chosen by the Electoral College. What happens is that each state chooses electors, the voters in each state choose electors to go to the Electoral College to choose the president. Today, and for a very long time, the way that works is that voters pull the lever in the voting booth for the presidential candidate of our choice. So we go in, we pull the lever for Donald Trump or Joe Biden or one of several third or minor party candidates. But we aren't actually choosing a president, we are choosing electors to go to the Electoral College and choose the president. In every state but 2 on a winner-take-all basis. And this is why it's possible to lose the popular vote, but still win the presidency, as Donald Trump did, as George W. Bush did in the year 2000. And that was the first time in over 100 years. There were just 3 presidents in the 19th century who lost the popular vote, but won the presidential election. Now we've had 2 already this century. So each state gets the number of electors that is equal to the number of members of Congress from that state. So for example, Louisiana has 6 House members and 2 senators, so we send 8 electors to the Electoral College. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, we can't share screens. I was going to just show a map of the United States with the number of electors from each state. But obviously, the more populous the state, the more electors that state gets. Here's what else skews the Electoral College from the popular vote, and that is that the least populous states are overrepresented in both the Senate and the Electoral College, because even the states that only have 1 House seat get 3 electors, 1 House seat plus 2 senators. And that means that in the Electoral College, as well as in the Senate, smaller, less populous states are overrepresented, and for the most part, those are sparsely populated, more rural, and generally more conservative states. And that's why the Republican Party has an advantage in both the Electoral College and in the Senate. So,
Chris, you can share your screen if you want to try.
Oh, okay. I'll put that map up. Thank you. So if you can see it, the states that are overrepresented in the Electoral College are these Western, sparsely populated, generally conservative states of Alaska, Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota. There are also small, more liberal and democratic states in the Northeast. Vermont, which happens to be the home of Bernie Sanders, Delaware, which happens to be the home of Joe Biden. Washington, D.C., although it is not in any state, also gets 3 electors in the Electoral College since 1961. And that also is Democratic. But there are more Republican, conservative, rural states with 3 electors than there are liberal Northeastern areas. And so, because of the winner-take-all method of choosing electors in every state except 2, Nebraska and Maine, which are more proportional, again, this means that it is possible to lose the popular vote and still win the election. That's one problem many people feel with the Electoral College. I think, in my opinion, a more serious problem is that it violates the one person, one vote principle, since voters in these smaller or less populous states are overrepresented in the Electoral College. And this has become a more serious problem in recent decades as the states have become more clearly Democratic or Republican. And so that means now there's really only a handful of what we call swing states, states that could go either way, Democratic or Republican. And so the presidential election really comes down to those few swing states. Voters in states like Louisiana, where we know it's going to go Republican, we know Louisiana is going to go for Donald Trump. And so that kind of demoralizes voters in all but the swing states. That's another problem with the Electoral College. We feel kind of disenfranchised. And so the question arises, why did the framers set up the Electoral College in the first place? And there were a few reasons. First of all, federalism. It's this desire to maintain the states as units. And when the Constitution was written, people really felt more loyalty to their state, their former British colony, than they did to the United States, which didn't even exist yet. And so states being treated as units, that means each state gets to decide how they choose electors to go to the Electoral College. and almost all of them, as I said, go on the winner-take-all basis. Another reason why the framers set up the Electoral College the way it is that they still were leery of democracy, still leery of the common man and his, of course they were all men, white men, property owners. Even so, the founders, who were rather still aristocratic in attitude, were leery of the common man, and so they thought it would be better to have voters choose electors, who then in turn would choose the president. And then the third reason is that back in the 1780s, transportation and communication weren't nearly what they are today, and voters in many states really couldn't get to know anything about the presidential candidates, but they could choose local electors whom they knew. And so these are all kind of outdated reasons to maintain the Electoral College, of course, but defenders of the Electoral College today maintain that we still should keep it in order to maintain the integrity of states as units. It's that defense of federalism. And then, of course, the defense of the Electoral College is very partisan today. Everybody knows today that Republicans have the advantage in the Electoral College. So as long as that's the case, Republicans will never support abolishing the Electoral College. Should the pendulum swing somehow and Democrats ever have the advantage in the Electoral College, then it's the Democratic Party that's going to defend the Electoral College. And so I think that we will be stuck with the Electoral College pretty much forever. The swing states, the most important swing states in this election are going to be Pennsylvania and Florida. Those two states probably will determine the outcome of the presidential election, along with, to some extent, probably Wisconsin, Minnesota. Yeah, it's pretty much going to come down to those, a few other swing states like Arizona. But that's how the Electoral College works. That's how it violates the one person, one vote principle, making it very controversial. But that's also why we'll probably have it for certainly the rest of our lives and maybe for the rest of the life of the Republic. And with that, I turn it over to Professor Dupont.
Our next presenter will be indeed Dr. Dupont, and he will talk about the long-range trends at work in the US electoral process that one should pay attention to, issues such as growing polarization and tribal loyalties. The floor is yours, Dr. Dupont.
Thank you. Chris, you may need to unshare.
I'm sorry, yes. There.
Thank you, Günter. I'm glad to take part in this. I have to tell you, as we start, I'm a historian, not a political scientist. So my colleagues are much better prepared, I think, to give insights into the election. If that's not enough, 4 years ago in Innsbruck, I was on a panel about the 2016 election and was happy to predict that Clinton would win. So that gives you some insight into how much I know. I think, in my own defense, that the turnout was a little bit different than I think most people had predicted. But at any rate, I'll do my best for 2020, at least to put it into historical context. And the theme of this brief presentation is the fact that what has marked American politics over the past 4 or 5 years is an extreme tendency towards polarization. Now, the characteristics of polarization are heightened partisan voting. That is to say, people stick with their party affiliation more than perhaps in the past. A failure to compromise, and a general violation or ignorance of or rewriting of political norms. So what had been normal in the past under polarization is no longer. And it seems that the United States has been subjected to this pretty much for a long time, but most severely, I suppose, over the past few years. Now, partisanship is one thing. Polarization really goes beyond that. And the suggestion in the literature is that polarization includes not only the political, but social as well. And Pew Research has done some recent studies to indicate that politics now affects friendships, it affects family relationships. It is likely, for example, that among very liberal Democratic voters, you have little or no friends who are Republican. Among extreme Republican voters, few or no friends who are Democratic. So the political has become social to an extent that maybe it goes beyond what we've experienced before. In extreme cases, from partisanship to polarization, one can also see a tendency towards authoritarianism. This has some certain logic to it. If the two sides are very bitter against each other, whoever is in power will try to preserve that at all costs. And on occasion, this leads to authoritarian tendencies. Now, I don't want to suggest this is unique in American history. It's not. If you go back to the elections of 1800 or 1824, you can see some of the same tendencies, a great deal of controversy and bitterness. And of course, in the United States history, the prime example of this is 1860, the election at the time of the Civil War. So it is not unique, but I think most observers consider it getting worse and worse maybe over the past few decades. I'll mention quickly, this is not limited to US politics. One sees the same tendencies in Poland, in Hungary, in Brazil, in Turkey, to a lesser extent perhaps in the UK. And what has emerged is this sort of strongman syndrome that represents one side or the other of polarization. I want to point out, though, three sort of things to look at in the United States for this election. And the first comes from a study that Carnegie did just recently on polarization. And they make the argument that the United States is distinctive in that it has several of the characteristics that lead to polarization. In particular, religious divide. In the US, evangelicals versus others, extreme believers versus non-believers, or those of more liberal sects. Race and ethnicity in the United States as well. Roughly speaking, white versus people of color, brown and black. This is exacerbated by recent demographic change, which tends to suggest that over the next several decades, the white share of the population will diminish to the point where it is no longer in the majority. And the third factor that Carnegie points out is ideology. Roughly speaking, an amalgam of economic viewpoints, attitudes towards government, and so on. And so whereas in some countries, authoritarianism and polarization derives from maybe one of these factors, it is unfortunate that in the United States, we are cursed with all three. And this seems to be making the polarization even worse. I'd add a fourth factor to this that postdates the Carnegie study, and that is the effects of the COVID pandemic. And it seems that that has worked its way into ideology and attitudes towards government as well. And so it may be even heightening even more the polarization for this election. So US special characteristics are one thing to look for. A second is the role of media. We could hold an entire panel for several hours, I think, on this. But there's no doubt that the evolution of media over the past several decades has contributed to polarization. Some of this is counterintuitive. One would think with many, many more media outlets available via internet and the like, that it would diminish polarization. In fact, the evidence is the opposite. More social media outlets probably leads to more dependence on a single source rather than multiple sources. And at least in the United States, the role of Fox News and right-wing media in this has become dominant. It's hard to describe how astounding really this has been over the past decade or so. But the fact is that many, many Republicans in particular get all of their information from Fox News and only Fox News, and distrust every other media outlet that's out there. Again, Pew has done something recently on this. If you want to look at more data, the fact, though, in a quick summary, is that confronted with 30 news sources, Republicans trust 8 or fewer, Democrats trust 22 or so, and this shows a polarization between the parties and the like. So the role of media is going to be increasingly important. It was in 2016. It already is in 2020. Not always, I think, for the good of the politics, but that's what we have. And the third impact, I think, on the 2020 election is that polarization has led to an extreme amount of bitterness on the one hand. On the other hand, on sort of devotion to candidates, there are some astounding figures on how money is being raised right now. A candidate who wasn't even considered viable a couple months ago against Lindsey Graham in the South Carolina Senate race, in the last quarter alone raised something like $57 million. This is absolutely unprecedented. And so one can argue that polarization in this case has led to a good effect, and that is more involvement of people and smaller donors getting involved in the process. You can also see the effects of polarization in increased registration, in early turnout, in absentee and vote by mail. All of those, I think, most of those can be for the good in terms of citizen participation. And finally, polarization has led to what I think is the most disturbing element in the 2020 election, and that is widespread efforts at voter suppression. Complicating rules, limiting voting places. If you've read the news over the past day or so, you note that in Georgia, which just opened for early voting, some people were waiting up to 10 hours, particularly in poorer communities, communities of color, whereas in maybe more wealthy communities, the lines were much smaller. That isn't just a matter of habit of how you vote, but it was also the availability of these places and the like. So I hope this has given you some sort of context for understanding the 2020 election, and I'd be happy to take questions when we open up the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dupont. Also, thank you for staying within your time. Our third speaker is Dr. Jay Hakes. And Jay, could you talk a bit about the approach the two presidential campaigns are taking this fall, and does it contrast much to 2016?
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. 4 years ago, we had what was a very dramatic election. The Republicans nominated someone who had not held public office, Donald Trump, as their party nominee. And the Democrats nominated sort of an old party stalwart, the wife of a former president, former Secretary of State. And as Professor Dupont mentioned, somewhat to everybody's surprise, Trump won the election. So I'd like to look back and see, well, what might be different this time if we're trying to see whether this election will have different characteristics. So one way to look at it would be how have the candidates done unifying their party? Because you need, getting your party won't necessarily mean you win, but you have to sort of start with that base. So last time, Trump came in from the outside, and during the primaries, he was just castigated by the other candidates, and he castigated them, and you wouldn't have thought he'd be able to unify his party, but somehow or other, he was pretty much able to do it. So by the time we got to November, he had a unified party. The Democrats were fairly unified, but there were a lot of groups, the Sanders people, who were more on the left wing of the party. Some of the environmental groups were uncomfortable with Clinton and we're actually very critical of Obama, who had done more on climate change than all previous presidents combined. But some of the environmental groups didn't want to give him credit for that. So there was a Green Party that actually, under the American system, the third parties can really hurt the candidates that are closest to them ideologically. So the breakaway of these groups for Clinton were enough actually to give Trump the edge that he got. This time, after Biden had lined up the votes that he needed, he sort of went into hibernation for a while, and everybody was complaining he's not out there campaigning. Well, Joe Biden is a great telephone politician. And he was with all of his former rivals, the left wing of the party, the moderates in the party. He said, well, I'll give in to you on this, but I'm not going that far. And everybody bought into that. And he's a cagey guy. I would just say on a personal basis, he came to speak at my class at the University of New Orleans right after he was elected to the Senate. And to tell you something about him and about me, that was 1973. The next time I met him, he was running for president in 1988. So this guy has been around the block a good bit. He knows how to talk to people. And so he's going with a very unified Democratic Party. Trump's party is pretty unified. Among Republican elected officials, they pretty much all bought into the Trump agenda. And the Republican voters are pretty loyal. There's a large number of former Republican officials and elected and unelected in the foreign policy area and the environmental area who've endorsed Biden. So the party is not totally united, but some of these people from the past may not have that much sway with voters. Now, another way that political scientists like to look at an election is, are the voters looking for change or not? And so we look at, do you think the country's going in the right or wrong direction? So this time, everybody thinks it's going in the wrong direction, or the vast majority. And they may have different reasons why they think it's, they may think it's too liberal, they may think it's too conservative, but they want change. And last time, Donald Trump was able to milk this very effectively. When he was running, a lot of us who follow elections said, well, this is strange. He's not only criticizing the Democrats, he's criticizing all the Republican predecessors, George W. Bush and whatever. The advantage of that for him, looking back on it, was he had nothing he had to defend. He didn't have to defend Bush going into Iraq. He didn't have to defend anything. So he was your change candidate. This time, that's an awkward role to play. He still likes to play the role of the outsider, but he's been president for years. So, will voters hold him accountable for the virus? Was that something he could have prevented or not prevented? That's a very decisive factor here. And if voters are looking for change, they tend to wait till the end sometimes and then go with the person that they think is going to be the change. And you had this big movement to Trump at the end of the campaign last time. It looks now like the undecideds may be leaning a little bit more towards Biden. He's kind of the change candidate. I wasn't going to talk about money because it's astounding, but Professor Dupont has already done that. I would just say anyone who finds shopping online to be convenient can make a political donation in 30 seconds online. So if you get mad at some politician you see on television, you can look up who their opponent is and quickly send them money. And apparently millions and millions of people are doing this. So we're seeing big influxes of money. This made a big difference in the congressional off-year elections in 2018. Right now, that seems to be favoring the Democrats, but over the long run, it could benefit anybody. And then another thing I would say before I wrap up is look at how the candidates are kind of packaging or communicating with the public. With President Trump, there's been an effort to talk about the healthy economy. And the fact is that before the virus struck, the economy was growing steadily and unemployment was at really historic lows. So normally, as a political scientist, that would be almost the most important factor in predicting what's going to happen. But that message has been complicated by the um, uh, the fact that the virus has sort of upended that. And then you also have Trump's personality, where more than I've ever seen before, you get people who say, well, I agree with his policies, but I'm not sure I want to vote for him, which is a little bit unusual. Now, in the case of Biden, if you compare him to Clinton last time, you probably weren't here to see the TV ads in 2016, but the Democratic ads returned over and over again to Trump's sexual comments about women, and just repeated that over and over again, and thought that that message alone could kind of drive the election. And it turned out to maybe not be as decisive as they thought. This time, I think with the Democrats, if you see the Biden ads, and there are a lot of them because he's got a lot of money right now, he's talking about health care, he's talking about the environment, climate change, and he's talking a lot about getting the country back together again. And one of the ads that's running right now in the United States across the country is Biden being endorsed by Cindy McCain, who is the widow of John McCain, who was the Republican presidential campaign in 2008. So McCain was running against the ticket where Biden was the vice presidential candidate. So Biden, back when he was running for the nomination, the Democrats would say, well, we don't want him because he's going to cooperate with Republicans. Well, now everybody's saying, well, if we're going to get these undecided voters, maybe we ought to talk more about bringing us together. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays. In a normal election, I would think that would not be a decisive factor, but this election seems to be somewhat unique, and it could end up being a driving factor and maybe bring some people over that are kind of in the middle of the spectrum to feel more comfortable with Biden, so that if they're uncomfortable with Trump, they're not going to just vote for a third-party candidate. They'll go ahead and vote for Biden. So all these will be interesting to watch how they play off. Every election is different, and as Professor Dupont said, we all think we know before what might happen. The polls, incidentally, right now are very strong for Biden, stronger than they were for Clinton last time. But Clinton did have a lead in the polls that didn't hold up on election day. And then, of course, we sort of figured to overcome the electoral college bias that Professor Day talked about, candidate has to probably get about a Democrat probably has to win by about 3 percentage points nationally to be sure to win the electoral college, maybe even more. So, afterwards it will be easier to explain what happened than to predict what happened.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hakes. I have 2 more questions. I'm going to come back to Chris and then one more for Jay Hakes. Chris, can you tell us a bit about the crucial Senate races and why the Senate is so important in U.S. politics?
Yes, sure.
Where's Chris Day again?
Hi. Yes, of course, for any legislation to to become law, it must pass both the House of Representatives and the Senate. The Senate actually has some more authority that the House does not. Especially important is that the Senate confirms presidential appointments to the federal judiciary, as well as most of the highest level executive branch appointments. And right now, the headlines are all about the most recent Supreme Court nominee of President Trump. The Senate also ratifies treaties negotiated by the president, and the House doesn't have a hand in that. Currently, since 2 years ago, there is a Democratic majority in the House of Representatives, and the Senate 2 years ago retained its Republican majority. So for the first 2 years of President Trump's term, he had Republican majorities in both the House and Senate. That changed in the House 2 years ago. It looks likely to change in the Senate this time. The good money is on Democrats taking over the Senate, in particular because while there are 2 current Democratic seats that are likely to be, or one that's likely to be overturned and one that may. There are about 13 Republican-held seats in the Senate that are either toss-ups or likely to go to the Democrats. Currently, the Republican majority in the Senate is 53 to 47. So the Democrats need to change at least 3 seats, but they're going to lose 1 and possibly 2. The one that the Democrats are almost certainly going to lose is in Alabama, which is a very strongly Republican state, through a series of kind of idiosyncrasies. 6 years ago, they did elect Democrat Doug Jones to the Senate, but he is almost certain to lose that seat this time around. Colorado, which currently has a Democrat in a seat running for re-election, is a toss-up between Democrat Cory Gardner and his Republican challenger. Then there are about 13 seats in the Senate held by Republicans, some of which will almost certainly go to Democrats. Arizona in particular will probably switch from Republican to Democrat. North Carolina, Maine, Iowa, Georgia, Montana, all likely switches to Democrats. Dr. Dupont talked about Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, who just a few months ago looked like he would certainly win re-election, and now that's a toss-up, as well as several others. And so I'll stop there, but would be happy to answer more specific questions.
Thank you, Dr. Day. We are going to come to questions, so I'll ask Jay Hakes to be brief, to give us finally a roadmap how election night is going to unfold. Jay, how do you think, what will happen on election night? What should our European friends look for?
Okay, well, election night is going to be very messy. And one other contrast with 2016 is a large number, actually probably a majority of people are going to vote by mail or vote early some way. And in many states, these mail-in votes are not tabulated till after they've tabulated the same day votes. So in states that have a very large mail-in vote, those states won't have results on the night of the election. Of course, in Europe, people are on a different time zone. So if I was in Europe, I would get up, early on Wednesday to find out who won the election. And I would look at the states that count the mail votes early. And so that would be Ohio, North Carolina, and Florida. Those are 3 states that President Trump pretty much needs to win all 3, but are in the toss-up column. Maybe Ohio leans Republican for Trump, but those are states that could go either way. And so if you see Florida, you should have that by the time you wake up on Wednesday, or we'll have it here if we stay up late at night. And if Biden has won Florida, that probably means that he's winning the whole thing, because it'll be hard to do the math in the Electoral College and make it come out in favor of President Trump. If it's close, it means that the polls probably overestimated a bit the Democratic strength, and it may mean that the election could possibly go to Trump, or even if it doesn't, it's going to be drawn out because we're going to have to wait for all these absentee ballots to be counted in the other states. So that's how I would watch the election. I would realize that the results will come in slower this time, but look at those states where they're going to have counted those mail votes, because until you get the mail votes in, you really, the tabulations aren't going to be sufficient to know who's carrying that particular state.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hakes. I should say that before we start with our questioning, that I wanted to thank our 2 techies who are here in the room with us, Christian Stenico, an American studies student from Innsbruck, and Dr. Mark Landry, my colleague from Center Austria. They both are making this possible technically. So the way we're going to go about it is questions to Chris Day will go into our chat box, and she is not with us in the room, but questions to Dr. Dupont and Dr. Hakes will come to us in the room. So why don't we get started? Questions, please.
If you write the questions into the chat box, we can unmute you.
So Innsbruckers, be brave. Questions, please. Okay, Cornelia Klecker is our colleague in Innsbruck who is organizing this together with Christian in the beginning. So Cornelia, your question, please.
Hi, everybody from Innsbruck. Thank you so much, first of all, for doing this for us and also for your very interesting roundtable discussion already. I would like to ask Dr. Hakes, if I may, you mentioned due to more extensive mail-in voting this year around, that tabulation might take longer. But you still felt somewhat confident that, yeah, maybe a day later we'll find out. Some reporters, experts I've heard, like in the news media, sort of also said that, yeah, maybe we would need to wait weeks. Do you think that is possible, that that might actually happen, or do you see that as more unlikely? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question, and it's a little bit complicated to answer because all the states handle it somewhat differently. If you go back to 2018, they were still counting votes in California 2 weeks after the election. And so we didn't know really for a couple of weeks how some of those congressional districts would turn out. So I think in a lot of states we'll be able to tell, but the nightmare would be that a state like Pennsylvania would end up being the pivotal state, and we wouldn't have the results. And I think there will be some states that it's going to be more than a couple of days. The absentee voting is just so large. And what's been happening is the Democrats have been encouraging their people to vote early because they like that, because then they know who hasn't voted and they can contact them to vote. The Republicans, because President Trump has been kind of dismissive of mail-in voting, haven't voted so much. So their people are more likely to go out on the day. So the day vote may look a little bit more Republican than the final vote. So I don't think we can guarantee that it will just be a matter of a couple of days if it's a close election.
Thank you. We have one question that was entered into the chat. Just one message concerning the vote by mail. How would the pandemic circumstances influence Republican outcome? Question to all the panelists.
Well, the pandemic is kind of the worst news you can have. I mean, we always used to tell the story in some ancient kingdoms when there was a hurricane, people would throw out the emperor. It wasn't really the emperor's fault. So, a lot of people think that President Trump could have prevented the spread of the virus if he'd acted earlier. But whether he did or not, it's kind of a bad news story for him. I've certainly disrupted the economy. You have all the unemployment. And then it is, as you suggest, very closely tied to the absentee ballot thing, because a lot of people are still not feeling comfortable about going out and about. And I think Democrats, the polls have showed, are maybe a little more cautious. So absentee ballot, a lot of states like Oregon have been using absentee ballots for decades and had great success with them. They mail every citizen a ballot, and people are comfortable with it. I think even when the pandemic subsides, this is going to be a more permanent feature of future American elections. But I would hope that some reform movement would urge these ballots to be counted before, when possible, and not just afterwards, because I think waiting for the result is not an optimal situation.
Okay, we have another question.
You cut Chris, yeah. Chris, yeah.
Loud.
Just a moment. Marie Anderlik, I'm gonna her to unmute herself to ask her a question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Welcome,
Chris, you said that the seats in the Senate, I think 2 of them are very likely to turn. And I was wondering whether these seats are being voted by the people directly. And I have something in mind. Wasn't one of Obama's main issues with going through with political decisions the fact that he had a Republican Senate and will then, if Trump may be reelected, this now Democratic Senate will be an issue for him likewise? Do you think that this could influence his politics, or do you know what I mean?
Yes. Yes, very much so. Senators are directly elected by the people in their states. That was not the case until 1913, but now it's been a little over a century that senators are directly elected. And the thing about congressional elections in the United States is that even in this era of very strong partisanship, state and local factors go a very long way to determining who wins those elections. And our elections tend to be more candidate focused than they do in parliamentary systems like in Europe. And so there are a lot of individual state and local and candidate related characteristics that go into these Senate elections. And so there are 2 Democratic seats and about 13 Republican seats that are either very likely to turn or that are toss-ups. And that's why we expect a Democratic Senate majority after this election, but we really don't know for sure. We expected a Democratic Senate actually 4 years ago in 2016. A lot of political scientists, including myself, thought that Donald Trump would be kind of a drag on his party in congressional races, and that turned out not to be the case. And even now, it's unclear. And then other panelists talked about how loyal Republican senators have been to President Trump. Just in very recent weeks, that's changing to the extent that there was a headline I ran across today that said Senate Republicans scramble to put Trump at arm's length. And so some Republican senators like Lindsey Graham, who've been extremely loyal to President Trump, are now starting to try to distance themselves as President Trump sinks further in the polls. But what happens on election day can be determined by so many things that are hard to foresee at the state level. And yes, certainly if the Senate majority goes Democratic, even if President Trump wins re-election, which isn't likely, but it could happen, then he'll be able to do much less with a Democratic majority in the Senate, including having his nominees confirmed. So I hope that answered all your questions, Marie. Thank you. Those are great questions.
Thank you.
Okay. Our next question is from Greta Tröber. Could you unmute yourself?
Mr. Herbel, the floor is yours. Ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, good.
Great. I don't mean to be rude by asking the following question, but I was just wondering why the candidates in America usually are in their 70s or older, because in Austria we have a chancellor who is 35 years old. So I was just wondering, is the way to become, or the possibility to be elected such a long way, or you're smiling. I'm sorry, I was just really interested.
Okay, Dr. Hakes will answer your question.
Well, to put this in context, I remember when Bill Clinton and Al Gore were elected in 1992, they were the first people in that office who were younger than I was. And so I thought, the torch is being passed to the next generation. I always thought of myself as the young person in the room. Now Biden is older than I am. So from 92, we've gone from candidates who are younger to now having candidates who are older. So I don't know, you have to have a big Rolodex of people that you know all over the country to run for president. But someone like Buttigieg, if you were following the American election, he was the mayor of South Bend, young mayor, military veteran. He almost broke through. He came close in New Hampshire in Iowa, where he could have won the first two, and that would have been skipping a whole bunch of generations. So although there are some advantages to being older, you don't have the stamina, at least I don't, that I had when I was in my 40s and 50s. So I think there's a new generation out there, and it came very close to changing in the Democratic Party this time. And so I think we'll get younger candidates in the future.
And if I may just say a couple of words here also, in addition to what Dr. Hakes just said, I don't think we have older candidates because they're older. It's just like Dr. Hakes said, the way it shook out. We also, someone was asking about the role of younger voters, millennial voters, and there really are no third-party candidates this year that are exciting much attention and support from anybody, not the Greens, not the Libertarians, or any others. Millennials, of course, are one of the strongest electoral bases for Bernie Sanders, who is, I think, older than both presidential candidates and refers to himself as a socialist. And a lot of those younger voters 4 years ago didn't turn out at all. They were disappointed that Bernie Sanders was not the Democratic candidate. And it's hard to predict how many younger voters will turn out this time. I think that the more younger voters turn out, the more likely it is that Joe Biden will win. And I think that Bernie Sanders is campaigning harder this year than he did campaigning harder for Joe Biden this year than he did for Hillary Clinton 4 years ago.
Thank you, Dr. Hakes and Dr. Day. We have at least time for one more question.
Okay, there's another question from Severin Willmann from the UK. Could you unmute yourself?
Severin, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I don't know who I should ask this question, so I just give it out in the whole room. My question would be about the vice president selection of the presidential candidates. How do you think it will affect the election? Which new voter demographics could they target?
You want to start, Dr. Hakes?
Yeah, I mean, I think historically most political scientists feel that the number two people don't make a lot of difference. But I think in this case that both vice presidential candidates give a comfort level to an important part of the base. Within the Republican base, Mike Pence is very much admired. They agree with his conservative principles, and he's not as flamboyant as Donald Trump. So, I think it does help him. And then with, the questions have been raised about age. I think with the pick of Kamala Harris for the Democrats, it's kind of a signal to people that, yes, there is a new generation that's coming. She represents change. She represents sort of the immigrant population that has added so much to this country. So, I think she helped Biden a lot as a comfort level. She's also a pretty good debater. So, I think they help, but it's really the top of the ticket that will swing the voters, I believe.
Dr. Day, do you want to add anything here?
Not really. I agree.
Okay, good. Then we have one more question, and then our time will be up. So last question, please.
Leah Kühne from Germany.
Okay, Leah.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you. Leah, go ahead.
So my question would be, how do you think Trump's disease might change the election outcome? Or in how far Trump can use this disease he has now gotten over to his advantage?
To you,
Who
Dr.
wants to
Hakes?
take a shot? Bobby?
Yeah, well, implicit in your question is that he's finished with the disease or he's conquered it, and that's still a little bit of an open question. I think that if he truly is well, that he will try to use that to prove that the virus is not so bad, that people shouldn't be so afraid, and that somehow he's a strong person. He's got this rather, from my point of view, disturbing emphasis in his speeches on genes. And he keeps telling people that are for him that they have good genes and he has good genes. And I think that if he gets over the virus completely, we'll hear more of that. I think ultimately it probably isn't going to change a lot of votes. I think if it spreads anymore within the White House, or if, God forbid, somebody gets seriously ill or passes away, it might have an effect. But I think for now, it will not affect many votes.
Dr. Day, you want to add something to that? Chris?
Yeah, again, I agree. In a way, it could go either way. Now, President Trump is back on the campaign trail, holding rallies, showing how strong he is, or pretending to show how strong he is. Will that further energize his base? But of course, a lot of Democrats and maybe a lot of Republicans think it's kind of ridiculous. And then he's been running a campaign ad claiming that now currently very famous health expert Dr. Anthony Fauci supports President Trump. And Dr. Fauci says, no, he doesn't support any party or any candidate. He kind of resents seeing himself being used to support President Trump, but well, that's the nature of elections, this one in particular.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think our hour is up. We said we don't want to do a Zoom meeting longer than an hour. Dr. Dupont said if you want to email him with questions, he'd be happy to answer them. His email is rldupont@uno.edu. Or email him to Center Austria, which is a reminder that this session and the one coming up on November 10th was put on by Center Austria, the Department of History, and the Department of Political Science at UNO, along with the Department of American Studies at the University of Innsbruck. And if you enjoyed this panel, please come back to our second panel after the election to analyze the results, and that will take place on November the 10th. We now see the technology works, so we should have no problem with putting that session on. In the meantime, I'd like to thank Christian Stenico and Mark Landry for their technical help, and our three presenters, Dr. Chris Day, Dr. Bobby Dupont, Dr. Jay Hakes, for their expertise. And all those who asked questions, I'd like to thank for their questions. So thank you all, and we'll see you hopefully in a few weeks again. Bye-bye. Thanks.